Welcome to tonight's discussion. This evening we'll be talking about the importance of defending free speech and challenging manufactured consent. We've got four excellent speakers this evening joining us. Max Blumenthal has joined us from the States. He's the editor of Grey Zone. And Tony Greenstein, who will be well known to many viewers, I'm sure, as a long-standing activist and blogger. Marc Wadsworth, another long-standing black rights activist, somebody who was instrumental in ensuring that Labour elected the first black MPs in 1987, was very involved in the black section movement, and also was a close advisor to the Stephen Lawrence family. And Jackie Walker, again, will be well known, I think, to many viewers, who was another victim of the witch hunt. Jackie really stood her ground, and regrettably, the Labour Party still went ahead and expelled her from the party, even though she has a long pedigree of fighting for socialism, fighting for the Labour Party, and was indeed a former vice chair of Momentum when it was first established. This evening is the usual format. I'm going to invite the speakers to address the audience, and then we'll open it up to questions. I myself am a victim of the witch hunt that the Labour Party has been engaged in for the last 4 years or so. And I myself had to leave the Labour Party at the end of last year after spending 44 years of actually dedicated activism for the Labour Party. And I really feel now, and I think the other speakers this evening will probably agree with me, that free speech is under very severe threat, even though the Labour government in 1998 signed up to the European Convention on Human Rights, which enshrines free speech in Article 10. And that was brought in as part of British law, as part of the Human Rights Act. So it's interesting that the Labour Party has been at the forefront of actually trying to chill free speech when it comes to dealing with the issue of Palestine. And it's no coincidence, I think, that many of the people who have been targeted have been pro-Palestinian activists, and many of them are themselves Jewish. And in fact, the first speaker this evening is Tony Greenstein, who is the son of a rabbi, and his father was a veteran of the Battle of Cable Street when the Labour movement and the Jewish community stood shoulder to shoulder to stop Oswald Mosley's fascists back in 1936, I believe it was. So Tony, if you could open this evening with your contribution, and then we'll move on to Marc Wadsworth.
Okay, thank you, comrade. If maybe the chair or the technicians could also allow me to share the screen sometimes, I would be grateful, so I can actually show some graphics. I think the first thing to say is that ever since Corbyn was elected as the leader of the Labour Party, indeed even before he was elected leader of the Labour Party, the allegations of anti-Semitism began. They began with the Daily Mail alleging he was an associate of a Holocaust denier, Paul Eisen. And they've really flowed on from there. They've been manufactured, they've been simulated, they've been created, they've been falsified. Things like the Oxford University Labour Club affair, which was the key point in many ways. It was based on an ex-Israeli intern, chair of the Labour Club, who couldn't accept that the Labour Club supported the Israel Apartheid Week. That to him was anti-Semitic. And it should be pretty obvious to those who've been on the left of the Labour Party, even someone like John Landsman, who I don't consider on the left of the Labour Party, that this whole anti-Semitism campaign was contrived from the start. It was state-sponsored, and I have no doubt that probably in 20 or 30 years, some enterprising young journalist on The Guardian will no doubt, through a freedom of information request at the American end, discover exactly who was behind the campaign, who organised it, who coordinated it, who funded the research into the background of Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, because there was a lot of work done in that, digging out any old quote examining every meeting that they went to, etc. This campaign was not spontaneous. You really didn't need to be that bright or intelligent to understand it, because who supported the campaign? The Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Telegraph. All the papers who incidentally employed Katie Hopkins, who called refugees from Africa cockroaches, were the same papers who were so worried and upset about anti-Semitism. I find it baffling, really, how it is that the most racist papers in Britain can somehow be concerned about anti-Jewish racism. It doesn't match up. And of course, they weren't concerned about it, because at the time when Jews were suffering anti-Semitism in the 30s, the Daily Mail was a supporter of Hitler. It campaigned against the entry of Jewish refugees. And I have no doubt if something like that were to happen again, they would still be campaigning against the entry of Jewish refugees. So their opposition to anti-Semitism is strictly limited to the state of Israel. The second obvious clue was that there was a real problem for the anti-Semitism campaign, which was that they couldn't find any anti-Semites in the Labour Party. So what they had to do was change the definition of anti-Semitism through the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. No longer was it hatred or hostility to someone who is Jewish. It was hatred or hostility to the actions of the Israeli state. Now, racism isn't hatred of a state. When they always tell you that Israel has a right to exist, I say, no, human beings have a right to exist. States have no such rights. The same is true of racism. You cannot be racist against a state, but that's what the IHRA has done. The third thing we should ask ourselves is why you need a definition of anti-Semitism anyway. People don't seem to ask these most obvious questions. When my dad was one of thousands of Jewish working class Jews who tackled Mosley, along with thousands of non-Jewish workers, dockers and so on, in the East End. Do you really think before he went out of his door, he asked himself, do I have a definition of anti-Semitism in my back pocket? What is anti-Semitism? Of course not. If you lived under the terror of the British Union of Fascists, you knew very well what anti-Semitism was. You didn't need to have a definition. You only need a definition if you're actually trying to change the meaning of the existing definition, which everybody knows. And in those days, of course, the Board of Deputies, which is apparently so concerned about anti-Semitism, was telling my father and thousands of other Jews to stay at home, not to bother, not to go out, let them go by. And in the 1970s, when the Anti-Nazi League surfaced as a result of the growth of the National Front, exactly the same thing happened. They attacked the Anti-Nazi League, not the National Front. They were more concerned about what they saw as the anti-Zionism of the Anti-Nazi League than they were concerned about the fascists themselves. So we've now reached a point where that campaign has been successful. Jeremy Corbyn was overthrown. Unfortunately, Jeremy Corbyn did not understand that when they attacked him as an anti-Semite, they didn't mean he hated Jews personally. What they meant was he was giving carte blanche to the people they didn't like, that he was criticizing Israel, he was allowing anti-Zionists the full run of the party, and that was unacceptable. Corbyn himself, the main reason, of course, for the campaign was that Corbyn himself was seen as a threat to the special relationship. He was at one point anti-NATO, he was anti-Trident, he was unacceptable to British capitalism. And just like in the States with the Democrats, the ruling class in this country likes to have two safe alternative parties of capitalism. So whoever you vote for, the system stays the same. Corbyn, in his own way, was a threat to that. And that was why he had to go. But because he and Momentum and all the others around him didn't understand that, they started a purge of their own, and they made a rod for their own back in so many ways. we see this. If I can just, we see this in the last election, or rather the Labour leadership election, when the Board of Deputies has come up with its 10 pledges, or what I call the 10 commandments. And the 5th of those commandments is that thou shalt not have anything to do with anyone who is suspended or expelled. And if you do, you yourself will be suspended. That's a slight change from the existing 10 commandments, number 5 of which was thou shalt honour thy father and mother. But there you go. These are how things develop. This is very dangerous because this is a form of McCarthyism. It's saying, in essence, even if you're suspended, and usually under British law, if you're suspended, say you're from your job, that's a neutral act. You can't take it that the person is guilty because you're innocent before guilty. But according to the Zionists, if you're the subject of an allegation, then that allegation must be true. And of course, Keir Starmer, he said if I can pick it up on this sharing, can I operate this share screen thing now? Yes, here it is. You'll see, bear with me. This is an article from today's Jewish Chronicle. The Labour leader is ready to step up campaign. It's an exclusive, by the way. The Labour leader is ready to step up campaign against morally repugnant Jew hate. I have to ask myself, you know, I am naive. Why is it that anti-Semitism is the only form of racism? Sorry, I'm just, yeah. Why is it that anti-Semitism is the only form of racism that people like Keir Starmer are worried about? There are no Jews who've been deported like the Windrush victims. There are no Jews who suffer disproportionate imprisonment, deaths in police custody, economic discrimination. There's no offence of driving while Jewish or the rest of it. We don't even have a campaign, Jewish Lives Matter, because Jews are not under attack in this country. It is black people, quite clearly. Yet the only form of racism that Keir Starmer, I nearly called him Keir Hardy, but Keir Starmer.
A slight difference there, Tony.
There is a slight difference, yes. Is concerned about is a form of racism or prejudice against a privileged white community. And the question you have to ask is why? Just as you have to ask why it is that John Mann, the Tsar of anti-Semitism, he clearly has no sense of irony if he's called the Tsar of anti-Semitism, also put out a handbook about how to deal with the gypsy plague in 2016. He's an anti-gypsy bigot. Yet this racist was more than happy to adopt the mantle of fighting anti-Semitism. And I could go on. Tom Watson, he spent a lifetime demonizing immigrants and refugees, was somehow upset about anti-Semitism. It was all a nonsense. And I think we should know that by now. But the campaign has been stepped up over since Keir Starmer was elected. Anyone who thought it would die away with the demise of Jeremy Corbyn was very much mistaken. Now, if you speak to me, or if I speak on a platform, or Jackie Walker speaks, or Ken Livingstone, then anyone who's in the Labour Party on that platform, or even in the audience, will be suspended in turn. And that happened to both Jackie and me when we were in the audience at a very large Don't Leave organised Zoom meeting at which Diane Abbott and Belle Ribera-Addy, 2 black MPs, spoke, and there were immediate calls for their suspension. It is extremely unfortunate that the Socialist Campaign Group, of which they are members, instead of standing up for them, instead of saying we have the right to speak with whomsoever we want and we will not accept a McCarthy witch hunt in the Labour Party, apologised and gave way. And that is not the way to fight this witch hunt. And I also have to say, when I spoke, I was invited to speak by Birmingham Stop the War campaign, which is controlled by a group called Counterfire. They apologised. They ended up putting out a statement which effectively apologised for the fact that I'd been on the platform. And this is a supposedly revolutionary group. So I think we have extreme problems. The latest revelation in this Jewish Chronicle, if I can go back to the sharing again, in the Jewish Chronicle article, if I can find it.
It's on the screen now.
Yeah, no, I know. I'm trying to find the part of the article. Well, what the article says, I will find it.
Well, if you can't find it, Tony, maybe come back to it a bit later. Cause your time slot is
right. Okay. Well, what it actually says, I can't find it, as I say. So don't think.
Look through it, Tony, when we're
sure. Okay.
I've got the floor.
What the article says is the JLM have refused at the moment to undertake training for Labour Party staff because some of the staff are associated with the previous anti-Semitism. And therefore, it's quite clear what's going to happen. There is going to be a purge of any member of the Labour Party staff who is a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn. And so Zionism is becoming the cutting edge of the right, because let us be under no illusions. I mean, Zionism is a very useful thing to the right wing in order to make sure that the Labour machine is now purified again. And that really, I think, is our major problem. We need the left and others, the anti-racist movement in this country, to understand that Israel, the Israel they're defending, is the Israel where Netanyahu can say that he's annexing a third of the West Bank, and in the same breath say no Palestinian residing there will be granted Israeli citizenship. That is the quintessential definition of what apartheid is. To have two peoples living in the same space, one who are citizens, the others who are not citizens. And yet Keir Starmer declares himself 100% Zionist. And that is what we have to face with, that as Israel comes under increasing pressure, so things like this will continue to occur. I mean, my final point really is about this anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I have no doubt there were some anti-Semites. I have no doubt there have always been anti-Semites in the Labour Party. There was a time when the founder of the Fabians and the New Statesman, a man by the name of Sidney Webb, said, thank goodness we're not overrun, like we're not Jew-ridden like the European continental parties. And he explained that was because there's no money in it. So, I mean, there's been far worse anti-Semitism amongst the ruling elites in the Labour Party than anything today. It's like the example I give is of paedophilia. In a party of 500,000, you'll find some paedophiles, but no one would say the party is overrun by paedophiles. This was a clever campaign. It knew it could find some anti-Semites and then generalize from them to the rest. So we have a battle on our hands, and that battle is the fight for freedom of speech. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed for that introduction, Tony, and certainly struck a lot of chords with me in your opening remarks there. And talking about the Socialist Campaign Group, I was a member of the Socialist Campaign Group when I was in Parliament until the last election. Well, actually, I was a member of it until I was suspended and I was asked to leave. But there was never any solidarity, regrettably, from the campaign group, no public solidarity anyway, even after I was reinstated and then resuspended. But prior to my resuspension, as you will probably recall, there was a huge effort by over 100 Labour MPs, so-called Labour MPs, who were demanding that the whip be withdrawn from me for a year and that an investigation be mounted into how it was possible that I was reinstated into the party. And I then explicitly asked members of the campaign group for a message of solidarity. I hadn't asked for anything prior to that, and I'm afraid it was not forthcoming. And I think this issue is not just about the Labour Party. And when Max obviously addresses us a little later in the programme, talk, I'm sure, about the situation over in the States as well. This is something that is much wider, much bigger, I think, than the Labour Party. And what I found incredibly frustrating when I was MP and a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party and campaign group, was that on numerous occasions I raised the need for us to show some robust resistance to what was happening here. And that if we were serious about a ethical foreign policy, we absolutely had to resist this, because this was all about chilling free speech and solidarity with the Palestinian people. And it's ironic because we even had a presentation from a Palestinian activist who made that very point, that the anti-Semitism smear campaign was being used in order to silence solidarity with the Palestinian people. And it's incredibly regrettable because we had a moment in time which has now been lost to not only deliver an ethical foreign policy, but to deliver a transformational, modest socialist program. And it was a modest socialist program, but it will still be transformational given what we've experienced in this country for the last 40 years. We've lost that opportunity of a transformational social program and an ethical foreign policy on the international stage, I believe, precisely because we were running scared of the Zionist lobby, and we wouldn't stand up to the Board of Deputies and others who were making these outrageous accusations against Jeremy. And Jeremy Corbyn being advised, obviously, to continue to give ground and apologise all the time. And I was saying to Jeremy, don't apologise, Jeremy. You, of all people, have nothing to apologise for. And every time you apologise, you're merely feeding the beast and making them stronger. But regrettably, my counsel was ignored. And, you know, the rest is history. Not only has, you know, we lost the election, but, you know, the Corbyn project has been well and truly destroyed inside the Labour Party. And we're now going back to a variation of the Blair and Gordon Brown years. Anyway, moving on to our next speaker is Marc Wadsworth, another victim of the Labour Party witch hunt. And as I was saying in my opening remarks, Marc, a long-standing activist in the party and on the wider political stage, who was accused of anti-Semitism for having the temerity to turn up to the press conference to announce the Chakrabarti review into anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. And Marc merely asked a question, and he prefaced his question by pointing out that Ruth Smith, one of the right-wing Labour MPs, was sitting at the front and was passing documents to him from the Telegraph reporter, the political correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. And he merely pointed out that she was collaborating with a conservative sporting newspaper. And for that, he was howled down at the meeting. But you know, the point I think that Marc was making was that if we're serious, the party that is, was serious about dealing with racism, then it needed to do better than the attendance at that meeting, because it wasn't just journalists, there were Labour representatives, Labour members there. And I think Marc was the only black or brown face in the room, apart from Shami and Pienaar, the BBC correspondent, George Pienaar. He was there as well. That was the point that Marc made, and for that he was pilloried, accused of all manner of things, and ultimately expelled from the party. And I went and gave evidence in support of Marc at the kangaroo court that was held. I couldn't see how they could find against him. There's no evidence at all. All the evidence pointed in the opposite direction. He also had supportive statements from two other Labour MPs, Clive Lewis and Keith Vaz. But it counted for nothing. And there were 40 or so Labour MPs and peers who marched over from the House of Commons down to the hearing at Church House. The only thing that was missing was the white sheets and burning torches to try and influence a disciplinary hearing into a black guy. I mean, it was just appalling. It was an appalling scene, and it made me feel ashamed to be a member of the Labour Party at that moment in time. But Marc, I'm sure you'll have plenty to say about this whole agenda. So the floor is yours now for the next 10 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Comrade Chris. And thanks for hosting this Zoom meeting today, which I think is a very important issue that's being raised about free speech and opposing the manufacturing of consent. And I'm sorry that Ken Livingstone, my old friend and comrade, isn't with us today, and I'm sure we'll want to send our best wishes for a swift recovery from the illness he's currently suffering. And a belated happy birthday. I understand he was 75 just the other day.
Happy birthday, Ken.
I've been overwhelmed by the tsunami of support since my unjust expulsion, which you just described, from the Labour Party in April 2018. People have been outraged by the injustice. I'm actually stopped on the tube in the street by people who say, look, you know, you're Marc Wadsworth, aren't you? And I'm a bit hesitant to fess up to that, but when I ask them, you know, why, they say, well, actually, we really support you. You've really been treated badly by the Labour Party. It's a huge injustice, and I feel ashamed. I'm a Labour Party member, or I'm a supporter, and it really shouldn't have happened to you. And you, Comrade Chris, you were fantastic in standing by my side before we got a hearing, before the Kangaroo National Constitutional Committee, during and afterwards. And I'd like to place on record publicly my heartfelt thanks to you for being there and showing me what solidarity really looks like in the Labour movement. Solidarity that you personally have been denied by your parliamentary Labour Party comrades, which I think is absolutely despicable. You describe my punishment as perverse, and the decision of expulsion a predetermined decision. Black Labour frontbencher, as you described, Clive Lewis, gave a written statement, the same as Keith Vaz, who was then the chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee at the House of Commons. And he said the widely available, this is Clive Lewis, video evidence did not justify me being expelled. Fortunately, there's a 1-minute video of exactly what I said that went viral on the internet. Both politicians, Keith and Clive, were among prominent people who provided witness statements in my defence, yet these, as you said, were ignored by the disciplinary panel. New party General Secretary, as she then was, Jenny Formby, had said the process used by the National Constitutional Committee to hear the case was not fit for purpose. She was quoted, she was on record as saying that. She was also on Twitter commenting on what I'd said at the launch of the Chakrabarti report, saying she couldn't see that there was anything wrong with what I said. But that tweet was deleted as soon as she went for the post of General Secretary. There was a solid grounds for a legal challenge, which I didn't want to take the party to court, but I thought I had no option. So for 2 years, using Bernberg and Pierce solicitors, actually a Jewish founded firm, I fought the Labour Party, and I thought that I would get support from Jeremy Corbyn, my old friend and comrade, and John McDonnell. They said they'd support me, but they didn't lift a finger to help. And I think that came out in the leaked Labour Party report, that in fact they were colluding and complicit in some of our cases. Yours, Chris, Jackie's, Ken's, and mine. I find that, very saddening. I've been a Labour supporter most of my life. In 2016, I was unfairly disciplined. I mean, I left the Labour Party over the invasion of Iraq and Blair liar, the war criminal. But I was accused of anti-Semitism, and some say I was caught up in a purge of Jeremy Corbyn's supporters, that Labour Against the Witch Hunt was set up by Jackie and Tony to fight against. As a black activist, I fought racism and anti-Semitism all my life. My grandmother was Jewish. She used to talk to me about her life during the war in Elephant and Castle. That had a profound effect on me as a young man, a young teenager, as a child, her testimonies. Combat 18, the Hitler-worshipping paramilitaries, put me on a death list after I founded the Anti-Racist Alliance in 1991 and helped Doreen and Neville Lawrence set up the Justice for Stephen Lawrence campaign. They were the parents of Stephen Lawrence, and I introduced them to Nelson Mandela, and that brought the campaign to an international audience, and it became a cause célèbre. Last April marked the 25th anniversary. Last April, a year ago, marked the 25th anniversary of Stephen's brutal racist murder, and I was featured in 3 of the documentary series on Stephen Lawrence, A Murder That Changed the Nation. I've been on the front line side by side with Jewish, Black and other anti-racist campaigners opposing the fascist BNP, including on the Isle of Dogs, when one of their members became the first BNP fascist to be elected a councillor on Tower Hamlets Council. United together, we managed to shut down the BNP's Nazi bunker headquarters in southeast London, close to where Stephen was murdered. And they were running a vicious, hateful Rights for Whites campaign. And there had been actually 3 other murders, starting with Roland Adams, a 15-year-old, in the area of African, Caribbean and Asian young people. Despite my history of anti-racist campaigning, Labour expelled me by email the same day of June 2016, the launch of the Chakrabarti report. They thought that actually caught me out and I'd only been a member for less than a year and they could summarily just expel me. My lawyers wrote to them. They then reinstated me and suspended me immediately. And I didn't get a hearing for more than 18 months. No natural justice, no due process. And in the meantime, there was a media concocted firestorm, a trial by media. I was pilloried almost daily in national newspapers, and a report by the Media Reform Coalition actually pointed out, they did a survey of the BBC, Guardian, Sun, all the broadcast media and Fleet Street newspapers. And it's shocking that the Guardian was top of the list of papers that had both slandered Jeremy Corbyn and myself and called us anti-Semites, and the Sun was second. The BBC wasn't far behind. It was a frenzied time when the Chakrabarti launch was held in 2016, and we know that tens of thousands of people, many of them young, turned off by the old corrupt politics, had joined the Labour Party because of his radicalism and honesty and internationalism and anti-imperialism and his stance in support of the Palestinians and against the Israeli government's oppression of them. At the Chakrabarti event, I handed out a press release in defense of him. Don't forget that there'd been that vote by 172 right-wing Labour MPs, a vote of no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn. So it's a very frenzied time. And my organisation, Momentum, Black Connections, was very determined to support him. Yeah. I was dismayed when I saw journalist Kate McCann from the arch anti-Labour Daily Telegraph newspaper hand this press release to a member of the public who I didn't know who that person was. And that person then brusquely told me she was Ruth Smith, Labour MP. I'd never heard of her. Apparently she was elected just the year before. So it was completely new and, you know, anonymous. You know, she'd never raised a word about anything. I'd never heard of this woman. So I suspected an unhealthy, cozy relationship between the two of them. I later found out the MP was one of Corbyn's dissident front benchers who had resigned to damage him, and she was one of the 172. Mm. And when I spoke out in terms that you just described, Chris, about what I saw, goaded by Kate McCann, because you'd asked a hostile question of Jeremy Corbyn, describing me as a momentum activist, and I felt I should defend myself. And I did that in just a sentence, and then went on to say, but look around this room. This is supposed to be the launch of a report into anti-Semitism and all forms of racism. Where are the black people? I was the only black person called to speak. And Ruth Smith walked out at that particular point, yelling at me. She heckled. She said, how dare you? How dare you? How absolutely dare you? And the only word missing was the N-word. Mm. It really did feel very hostile. And some people have described it as a sort of reminiscent of the Deep South, when black men like me would be accused of visual rape for just looking at a white woman. Mm. And I've been, you know, Jewish people have said to me, you were actually the subject of a racist attack. You were the victim in that room, not her. And she staged a walkout, and the press said that she was crying. I mean, she's as tough as old boots, I found out. She's a tough pro-Israeli lobbyist and a hardcore, political operator. So the whole thing was staged. She used the opportunity to issue a statement saying that I was attacked by a Momentum activist. She didn't know my name at that point, and Jeremy Corbyn didn't defend me. He's therefore unfit to be the leader of the Labour Party and should resign. The people there, the journalists there, international journalists, they weren't interested in the issues at hand. Anti-Semitism, important fight against anti-Semitism, important fight against anti-black racism and Islamophobia. They were there for a scoop, an anti-Jeremy Corbyn scoop. And I was collateral damage in a faction fight between these right-wingers and those of us who supported Jeremy Corbyn. Just to round off, my hearing before the National Constitution Committee, there was a march by, well, the new media said 50 white MPs, Chris, you said 40, but the media said 50 white MPs, 50, members of parliament and peers. Grotesque when you think that the Windrush scandal was occurring at that time against black people. They'd never marched, Wes Streeted and crew who had organised that march and never marched for the Windrush, never marched against anti-Semitism, never marched against Islamophobia or anti-black racism. But here were they singling out a black man to go on the march to ensure that I was expelled from the Labour Party. And the hearing, which lasted 2 days, was chaired by Hammer of the Right, Maggie Cosin, a Labour First friend of Smeath. And we came up with screenshots of where they'd been chatting with each other. And so she should have recused herself. She wasn't fit to be running that hearing, that disciplinary hearing. But there you go. They didn't really care about justice. Their main aim was to make an example of me as a lifelong black veteran anti-racist and expel me from the party. Lots of people haven't voted Labour who are black as a result of what happened to Jackie Walker and myself, 2 prominent black activists. But of course, abstentions, they're not counted. So we don't know how many people we lost as voters. So much for free speech. And now I see that Ruth Smeath has got a job as the Chief Executive Officer of Index on Censorship, which is supposed to fight censorship. What an outrage. And Trevor Phillips, who's known for his Uncle Tom anti-Muslim statements to the media, where he earns thousands and thousands of pounds for the job, is the chair of Index on Censorship. Peter Mandelson was best man at Trevor Phillips's wedding, the archpriest of Blairism. So you begin to join the dots and see the connections and how they all help each other. Faced with crippling legal costs, I had to drop my court case after a 2-year fight. And I got no help from Jenny Formby, Jeremy Corbyn, or Lotto, the leadership office, or anybody, despite them telling people like yourself, Chris, that they were actually behind the scenes trying to help me. They weren't helping me. They weren't helping you. They weren't helping Jackie. They weren't helping Ken Livingstone. They were actively working against us. Asa Winstanley has written about this and others. And at some point, they have got to give an account of why they did what they did, appeasing, apologizing, and capitulating to this disgusting witch hunt. I've been doing a national speaking tour to clear my name, and it's been a huge success. And I will be continuing with that after the lockdown. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much indeed. I think it's so important that you do indeed continue with that, and that we, all of us, get behind that effort that you're putting in. But obviously, it's not just about you. I mean, I think the key thing is that we really build a momentum behind the need for the defense of free speech, because it is a precious commodity. And the manufacturing of consent, which we see very powerful vested interests using that to shape the debate. Jackie is one of the most well-known victims of that witch hunt, and many viewers will, I'm sure, have seen, and if you haven't, I would recommend that you get to see the film that was made about predominantly Jackie, but not exclusively her, but it was the way in which the witch hunt was being used to target anti-Zionist Jewish people and members of the Labour Party, Jewish anti-Zionist members of the Labour Party. And of course, we know, as I was saying earlier, that this issue is much wider than the Labour Party. And we know on the continent of Europe, for example, there have been very strenuous efforts to criminalise pro-Palestinian activism, to criminalise the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign. And there was a ruling, should I say, in the European Court, I believe, earlier this week, which overturned a decision in France. So, there's a massive challenge for us. I'll bring in Jackie in now because her tale is absolutely dreadful. And I have the greatest amount of respect and admiration for Jackie because she, as Mark and indeed Tony for that matter, withstood the attacks against her with great stoicism and dignity. And despite the fact that many people told me to distance myself from Jackie, I felt it was essential that when you have a platform as a member of parliament, that you use that to stand up for what's right. And I was determined to defend Jackie. And indeed, Jackie herself counseled me about my public support for her. But I don't know if you remember that conversation, Jackie, but I was very insistent that, it absolutely had to be done and we had to stand in solidarity with each other, because unless we do stand in solidarity, then we will lose, because the forces that are ranged against us are incredibly powerful, very wealthy, very well placed in society and media. And unless there is a collective effort, a joint effort of hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of us to stand together and say no, then we will be run down. We will not prevail. And so with that, I'll invite Jackie now to speak for about 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll have Max.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much. And, what can I say, Chris? You're absolutely right. Our lions of MPs, our lions of the left, our lions of Black members have been peculiarly silent, acknowledging the support that Mark had, but that was very few. I noticed, for example, today that Dawn Butler did a quite powerful speech in Parliament today, attacking the government's record on racism. And I was just waiting for her. Say something about what's going on in the Labour Party. Say something about the way that the leaked report showed the racist abuse that people of colour are subject to from those who control the structures of the Labour Party. And just one more thing before I sort of get on to the main topic, just picking up something that Mark said about us being collateral damage. I think that's very true. And I think it's really important for people to understand what that collateral damage was, because while I can't be sure, because the Labour Party doesn't keep figures on people's ethnicities, I'm absolutely sure that disproportionately this has affected people of colour. Disproportionately, this has affected Muslims who have been suspended and not allowed to stand for office. And disproportionately, and this is really important, it has affected Jewish members. At the moment, apparently, there are 25 Jewish members of the Labour Party suspended for anti-Semitism. Now, let that just sink in. All you've got to do is think what a tiny amount of Jews are in the party. I mean, if it's 2,000, it would be, I don't know, a lot, maybe 5,000, I don't know, but that 25 at the moment are suspended for anti-Semitism, and then ask the reason why. Because then I'm going to look at the issue we're thinking about tonight, which is free speech and what Chomsky calls manufactured consent. Now, what manufactured consent actually means is, how does the establishment, how do the powers that be get the mass of people, get a significant amount of people to agree to policies, to strategies that are actually against their own interest, or I would say actually an obscenity. And I'd just like to work through and just look at, as Mark was talking about, what had happened in terms of his case. So let's have a look at his case, because what you initially have, you have this setup, and the setup is that you have an inquiry which reports, and its terms are on anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. Now, for anybody with any common sense, and I was saying at the time, and I wrote to Jeremy about this, to separate anti-Semitism from other forms of racism was going to not just be a mistake, but would be a fault line that would be opened up and used against him. There is no reason at all why anti-Semitism should be hived off as another form of racism. I would say it's not special, or I would say it is no more special than any other form of racism. Each form of racism has its own characteristics and its own histories. But as soon as you make one form of racism special, then you're going to get into a very complex and an unbalanced response. So you have this report. You put this report out. Sorry. You have a reception for it. Even though it's about other forms of racism, there's one black person in the audience. Now just think about it. The Labour Party sends invites out, and it doesn't even realise that it hasn't sent any invitations out, apart from Mark, to black members of the party, to Romani members of the party, to Muslim members of the party. And that tells you in itself the level of structural racism within the party. Anyway, that's the setup. Then you have the incident with Ruth Smith, who I agree with Mark. She was a total non-entity to me. I mean, how we were supposed to know she was Jewish is beyond me. I mean, as far as I know, she was not wearing a Star of David. So, I mean, how we were supposed to know she was Jewish, I don't know. And she was a total non-entity. That non-entity has now become somebody that is going to be instrumental in talking about freedom of speech. So this is how you manufacture consent, because she will then be reported by all the media as an expert on freedom of speech. This woman, who is actually, as Mark says, actually fronted what looks like, for any black person looking, a political lynch mob. And then you have the media itself, who silences any opposition to the overarching narrative that they have, which was that Corbyn was an anti-Semite, that Mark, with his record of racism, was a racist, that Jackie Walker, who's Jewish and married to a Jew and a member of 3 Jewish organizations, is also an anti-Semite. But you ask to get into any of these newspapers or onto the BBC, you will not get any space. Again, you are manufacturing consent, because the public doesn't have access to any opposing views. And then what you do, if you're in the Jewish labor movement, you think, well, this is great. Things are going really well for us. Why don't we report the Labour Party to the EHRC for racism? And all you have to do, by the way, if you want to understand the EHRC, and who they are is look at who fronts their executive body. Have a look at their biographies, have a look and see who they are, and look to see how many members are from the African Caribbean community. Remember that the African Caribbean community is pretty much on the bottom of that hierarchy, that if you say there's a hierarchy, you will get expelled from the Labour Party for saying. And then you actually have the disciplinary processes of the Labour Party, which make sure if, as a Black person or as a Jewish person or as a Labour Party member, you speak out against this, if you in any way support somebody who is speaking out against it, that you will be disciplined. Now, I did suggest to my partner, who is white and Jewish, that perhaps we should be writing to the Board of Deputies and asking for consent to share a bed. And in fact, I did do that. I tweeted out to the Board of Deputies, you know, as long as we weren't using a platform, could we please sleep together? They didn't answer me. So then you have the community, the so-called Jewish community groups, who do not actually represent the Jewish community in any case, and they give this moral fiber to what's going on. You have the chief rabbi who comes on Thought for the Day and starts giving out moral yet political messages. This is a man who actually backs the Zionist state. So this is a man who, as far as I'm concerned, backs a racist state. Then, of course, you have the PLP. I mean, cowards flinch and traitors sneer. I mean, you could actually put that as a description of most of the parliamentary Labour Party, because I think they go into kind of two broad camps. They're spineless, self-interested, or they're ideologically totally underdeveloped. And it seems to me that one thing that Blair did was ensured that we had a PLP that reflected his interests and was able to be manipulated. And then you have a leader. You at last get the leader you want, Sir Keir Starmer, who then, as Tony has so well shown, having silenced and protected criticism, those who were showed so much anti-Black racism in the structures of the Labour Party against Black MPs, he's effectively silenced the criticism on that, while at the same time ensuring and assuring the Board of Deputies that they will get every one of their 10 commandments fulfilled. And there you have it. You have manufactured consent. So what do we do about this? Well, one of the things you have got to do is actually defend free speech. One of the things we have got to insist is that the left groups that represent us do not abide by the 10 commandments. In fact, we need to demand of them that our participation, our support of them is actually only going to happen if they give platforms to those who represent the interests of the left and of anti-racism. Now that's going to be a fight. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be a fight inside and outside of the Labour Party, but it's absolutely critical, because if we go silently into this good night, then this will just be the first stop and it won't be the last one.
No, indeed. Thanks very much indeed, Jackie. Yes, absolutely. We need to rage against the dying of the light. And is in mortal danger, it seems to me, that light of free speech and that goal that many of us in this country were hoping for of an ethical anti-imperialist foreign policy, first time in the UK's history. Which brings us on to our final speaker this evening. I'm absolutely delighted that Max has taken the time out. Max, as I've said at the outset, is joining us from the US, and Max is the editor of Grey Zone. And he's someone, one of the few, regrettably, these days, journalists who are doing the job properly, as it were. And I see Max as someone who is, if you like, rehabilitating the reputation of journalism, because journalism should be, and indeed Mark is himself a journalist too as well, journalism is a profession. It should be an honourable profession. It's an essential profession. But unfortunately, our media has been colonised by neoliberals, by people who certainly are opposed to an ethical foreign policy, people who are, if you like, cheerleaders for the military industrial complex. And in terms of free speech, we know that the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, as it's known in the States, has been very influential in the political scene over there, Max. And that might be something that you want to perhaps touch on, the influence of AIPAC on American politics, because it seems that Bernie Sanders was targeted, even though Bernie, like Jackie and Tony, Jewish, was somebody who was targeted. This was someone who was like Jeremy Corbyn, really giving hope, I think, to millions of American citizens that there might have been an alternative way forward for its elected government, and that some of the grotesque inequalities that we see in the United States and the mass incarceration and the imperialist wars that America has engaged in for decades might be brought to an end with somebody like Bernie Sanders assuming the presidency. But obviously that seemed to be something that was beyond the pale for key figures inside the Democrat Party, and indeed organizations like AIPAC, who were absolutely determined, it seems to me, from looking at it from the outside anyway, to prevent Bernie getting that Democratic nomination. So, Max, perhaps you could now speak for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions from the floor.
Thanks a lot, Chris. And I really thank you for inviting me into this community of blacklisted people that I really respect, that I've respected for years, who I've looked up to, who've inspired my work, including yourself. So it's a huge honor to be here. And, you know, I feel like it's a huge honor that we're all targeted by such odious interests that the public actually rejects. And, you know, if we lived in a true democracy, or if in the US, the Democratic Party was small d democratic, I don't think these interests would have anywhere near the power that they have. I'm having an interesting day here, so I wanted to address that. You know, every day I wake up and there's some new horror or outrage related to me being online. It seems that my phone here is like a weapon that can also be used against me. So last night, basically in the US, you have this fake liberal resistance. They call themselves the resistance to Trump, and they try to lift up every Republican national security monster who turns against Trump. And so the latest hero is John Bolton. So last night I tweeted that John Bolton was an enemy of every living being on the planet, and that, he figured out that that liberals will buy any piece of Cold War propaganda if they think it can be leveraged against Trump. So they're hanging on his every word now. And Donald Trump, I wake up today to realize that Donald Trump has retweeted me. So it's an amazing moment. Haaretz wrote an article about Trump retweeting me. I guess they're trying to say that there's some kind of, secret alliance between me and Donald Trump. But if you go back to 2016, Trump's allies through Sheldon Adelson took out a full-page ad in the New York Times claiming that me and my father, Sidney Blumenthal, were the secret Middle Eastern advisors of Hillary Clinton. And that was because of emails that came out first through a FOIA request and then on WikiLeaks, showing that my father had sent a few of my articles to Hillary Clinton, and she called me a mitzvah, which was hilarious. and so I'm her secret Middle East advisor. Next, I criticized Elie Wiesel after he died for the alliances he made late in his life with Sheldon Adelson, the Christian Zionist, racist, Islamophobe Pastor John Hagee, and Ted Cruz, and all these right wingers. He was basically trying to get all the money back that he lost from Bernie Madoff. And so there was this outrage on Twitter, and the Hillary Clinton campaign officially denounces me. Then the man who is soon to be Donald Trump's ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. I call him the U.S.-Israeli reciprocal ambassador because you can't tell if he's representing Israel or the U.S., and he has close ties to the settlement movement. He called me at a Trump rally in Jerusalem, he called me the biggest anti-Semite on earth. The Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is basically a proxy for Donald Trump's operation now, has listed me as the number 4 anti-Semite on the planet. I was ahead of a guy who went on a shooting spree against a neo-Nazi who went on a shooting spree against Jews, but I was behind Ayatollah Khamenei. So, I've been targeted by the Trump operation. Now I've been retweeted by Trump. And what I've been doing all day, because I'm on Trump's timeline, is changing my name. I changed it to Free Julian Assange. Then I changed my name to Free Palestine, Fire Jared, referring to the president's pro-Israel son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Now it's Viva Chavez, hands off Venezuela. So if you go to Trump's timeline, you see these slogans that I put up. So it's kind of a way of hacking Trump.
Yeah.
But we're living in truly bizarre times when politics seems upside down. Liberals are cheering on John Bolton. Donald Trump is retweeting the enemy of his enemy after condemning me. And this is all taking place on Twitter. So I want to talk about first, I guess, the Israel lobby's discourse suppression, but I also want to talk about the destruction of the commons that we use as a form of communication and how that will influence free speech going forward. I mean, speech is simply no longer free because our commons are the digital commons that are owned by Silicon Valley, which has been completely penetrated by the national security state. So I was alluding to some of the, attacks I've gotten from the Israel lobby. I was a consultant on the lobby project that Al Jazeera did. I helped conceive the whole project. I helped, one of the undercover journalists who penetrated the Israel lobby and showed its inner workings, both in the UK, exposing people like Ruth Smeeth, and in the US, exposing the Israel project, was a friend of mine. And, we were working together throughout this important project. And what it showed was everything that you have all experienced in the UK, where a foreign apartheid lobby basically penetrates the inner circle of government and wields the issue of Israel to carry out witch hunts, to basically illicitly pay off officials to do their bidding, and to manipulate the media. It's what we all knew, but it was something that the public had never seen in such detail before. And so after this important documentary aired about the UK side of the Israel lobby, in the US, Congress mounted a giant, pro-Israel interests in Congress mounted a campaign to prevent Al Jazeera from airing this documentary. So many bizarre things took place. The monarchy of Qatar, which was under a blockade from Saudi Arabia, began paying off influencers around Trump, including the head of the Zionist Organization of America, Morton Klein. Alan Dershowitz was then sent to Qatar to give a speech at Georgetown University in Doha. And one of his asks to the emir was that they not air this film. And so the film was pulled by the Qatari monarchy under pressure from the Israel lobby. I mean, this is amazing and shows their power, under national security, on national security grounds, according to the emir. And the US public never saw this film. It had to be leaked at the Gray Zone. We showed parts of it where Black civil rights veterans were being paid by the Israel lobby to attack Palestine. And we showed how Black Republican activists were being paid to show up at anti-Palestinian rallies to give them this kind of astroturfed multicultural feel. This documentary exposed it all, and it was completely suppressed. So it actually, the suppression of the documentary confirmed the power of the Israel lobby, the global power, the power to even influence the permanent monarchy of Qatar, a government that supports much of the infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, including the Hamas party. And we saw Israel lobby mainstays like Morton Klein taking money from that government. Alan Dershowitz apparently did as well. So this is just, it was truly, truly amazing. The next, assault that the Israel lobby waged was on Jeremy Corbyn. Of course, you all know that. You've lived that. He was much more dedicated to the cause of Palestine in a much more authentic way than Bernie Sanders. And I don't think, although Bernie came under attack, I don't think that AIPAC or any of these interests took him as seriously as they took Jeremy Corbyn. And I can tell you some of the people that were around Bernie Sanders as foreign policy advisors are people that I've known who've been kind of on the outskirts of Palestine circles and are not only not taken seriously, but are seen as kind of enemies of the movement, people who've undercut the movement at various points. Of course, Bernie would have been a breath of fresh air, but that never happened. So I was one of the first people who was targeted in the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn right when he began his candidacy for Labour leader. And it's because he had this tradition of allowing, Palestine solidarity activists and journalists and educators to speak at Portcullis House, and he would sign off on it. He was the head of the Palestine Committee, I believe. Yeah. So he wasn't even present, but he signed off and allowed me to speak there at Portcullis House. And I think it was the Daily Mail fired off this attack because Richard Millett had been in the audience, and he said, Max Blumenthal is a notorious anti-Semite, and I was, the complete lie. A Holocaust denier opened up for me. This was a complete fabrication. But, the fabrication made it to the Daily Mail and started going around. And I went to Jeremy Corbyn's staff and I said, to his chief of staff, and I said, I would like to respond to this and blow this lie out of the water. And they said, we don't think it's wise to respond to these attacks. The people are with us and we're just going to let it go. And that really shows that's what they proceeded to do for years. And the attacks continued. And and the point is, if you give the Israel lobby 1 inch, they will take a mile. Now, on top of, and this is a layer I wanted to add to this discussion, on top of the use of Israel as a weapon against the left, as a weapon against foreign policy critics, dissidents. With the election of Donald Trump, this narrative of Trump-Russia collusion was leveraged by the national security state in the US and the UK to enact their longstanding project of reviving the Cold War, number one, to amp up Russia weapon sales and justify their budgets, the budgets of the FBI, the CIA, the Pentagon, whatever, but also to stamp out dissent. And I said from the beginning, while it's being used against Trump, it is going to blow back on the left. We saw it used against Bernie Sanders, and we saw it used against Jeremy Corbyn. And they were both attacked in ways that made it impossible for them to defend themselves, because it was said in mainstream media on both sides of the Atlantic that each candidate was covertly supported by Russia, according to intelligence reports that the public could not view. In the UK, Jeremy Corbyn was said to be supported by Russia online through accounts that were analyzed by a group called Graphica. And at the Gray Zone, we exposed this group as a cutout of the Pentagon, of the Defense Department, funded by a think tank in the Pentagon called the Minerva Institute. And so the Pentagon was actually smearing Jeremy Corbyn as a Russian agent and interfering in British politics, and making good on Mike Pompeo, currently the Secretary of State, former CIA director's promise to, quote, push back against Corbyn if he is elected. I just constantly go back to A Very British Coup, this book and film, as a model for what's happening to anyone who steps away from the foreign policy consensus in mainstream British or US politics. That's what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. It would have happened to Bernie Sanders. And much of it is taking place through online attacks on these digital commons that are increasingly managed by the national security state. Then, it filters down to the rest of us, those of us who are seen as the allies. Wikipedia, which is regarded as the world's largest encyclopedia, which is supposed to be reliant on the input of users around the world, sort of a public, transparent mechanism for disseminating information and debating and then coming up with a consensus, has listed the Gray Zone, the news site I founded, as a deprecated source. This took place in March, and we investigated how this took place. And basically, all of our enemies who are anonymous, who could be working in the government, who represent the right wing of Venezuela, who support a coup there, neoconservatives, all sorts of different elements got together and edited and created an entry on whether we were a reliable source. And based on our politics and our publicly stated political views, they deprecated us and listed us as a news site that disseminates false or fabricated information. We have never published fabricated information. We've never had to issue a major correction or retraction. And we're, as Chris said, I think we're one of the few news sources left that advances an anti-imperialist viewpoint. So it was paramount for them to suppress us. Now you cannot use us as a source on Wikipedia. One of the key figures going after us is someone you all know, Philip Cross, who spends all day, I don't know if it's one person or it's a military style operation, but spends all day making at least 40 edits on anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist accounts. 40% of my personal account is edited by Philip Cross. Jimmy Wales, the Ayn Rand devotee, who is the founder of Wikipedia, has issued a statement of support for Philip Cross. Jimmy Wales is married to the former secretary of Tony Blair. And the head of the Wikimedia Foundation, Catherine Marr, is someone who not only worked at the World Bank and Goldman Sachs and two of the vampire squids on the face of humanity, but also emerged out of the US regime change establishment through a group called the National Democratic Institute, which was founded out of the National Endowment for Democracy, which funds regime change operations around the globe. So these Silicon Valley sites that are constantly blacklisting us, condemning us, they're run by people who share the agenda of the trolls that somehow have disproportionate power on these platforms. And it's at the same time, they say that Chinese accounts and Venezuelan accounts or pro-China accounts must be erased and deleted. So the attack on free speech isn't just an attack on what can be said, it's an attack on what can be seen. And there is a disappearing campaign of any information or opinion that contravenes the Western foreign policy consensus. Just in closing, I would just quickly wanted to mention Julian Assange. I would really, if anyone hasn't seen my latest investigation on Assange, it's called The American Friends. It's at thegrayzone.com. And it's about how a apparent CIA contractor called UC Global was contracted through one of the kingpins of the Israel lobby to kind of give the CIA cover, a very close ally of Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump, Sheldon Adelson, a close ally of Netanyahu, of course, as well, to carry out this campaign of dirty tricks and spying on Julian Assange and all of his allies and every journalist who visited him while he was in the embassy in London. And just what I wanted to mention here, just about the media, I don't have time to go through all of the dirty tricks, is that mainstream reporters from the Washington Post and the New York Times, when they visited Julian Assange in the embassy, they had their phones open and hacked without them knowing. Their devices were hacked into, apparently by the CIA. And this is something that's illegal. The CIA is not allowed to spy on Americans. Mike Pompeo even said that he would not spy on Americans as he pledged this campaign against WikiLeaks. And those reporters have said nothing about this. I have photographs of their open phones that have come out through this Spanish court case against that company that was the contractor. And these reporters have said nothing. Can you imagine if Vladimir Putin's FSB did that to reporters? How outrageous it would be. It seems that if Israel or the US intelligence agencies meddle not only in politics, but actually in the media and target journalists inside Western societies, there's silence. This is really shocking to me. And in closing, we have a really interesting moment here in the US. As I mentioned up top, politics is just completely in flux. We have one of the highest unemployment rates on the planet. People who work at home don't understand the pain of people in the streets who are lining up for blocks and blocks and blocks for unemployment or simply for food. I can see it down the street from me in where I live, which is one of the poorest and most traditionally Black neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. But this is happening all over the country, and people are outraged, and they're in the streets. They're in the streets to declare that Black Lives Matter. They're into the streets to state that police should not be able to prey on people, particularly people of color, as they wish. But they're also in the streets because there's just this general sense of outrage. And those people are listening to us. And that's the fear. So we're going to see much more repression, and we're going to see pushback against that repression in the streets. And I already saw that pushback as the military was turned against us in Washington, D.C. I witnessed a military show of force. We had military Black Hawk and Lakota helicopters buzzing above our heads at 100 feet. I was there just trying to hold on. Bottles were flying, dust was flying, trash was flying. My bike flew at me, and protesters were just trying to hold on. This was one of the ultimate attacks on free speech in the US. And so, when right-wingers say, Tom Cotton, the senator who called for the US military to be used against protesters, getting his, getting the op-ed editor of the New York Times fired because he wrote his op-ed was terrible. That's an attack on free speech. Bullshit. The attack on free speech is what Cotton proposed. The attack on free speech was Trump having the DC police tear gas protesters so he could do a photo op. And so we need to stand with this movement that's out there on political grounds, of course, for what they represent and their message, but also simply on the grounds of free speech. And there is a serious effort to use militarized police and the military that is ongoing across this country, most recently in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to clear the streets. So keep your eye on that. And don't, I mean, people are saying, what should we do? I would just say, let's just stop operating on the basis that we live in a democracy. Let's stop taking that for granted.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more on that, Max. And indeed, I've written recently about the whole issue of representative democracy that we sort of hold up as a model of democracy. But my question is, or the question that I've rhetorically been posing in pieces that I've written and where I've spoken, is if representative democracy is supposed to be so good, how is it in the United Kingdom we have 14 million people living in poverty? How is it in Britain, if representative democracy is so good, that we have thousands of people sleeping on the streets? And Britain is the 5th biggest economy in the world. And clearly representative democracy has failed. And my question has been, who are these representatives actually representing? It's not the wider general public who put them there. Clearly, they are representing the corporate interest, corporate world, the military-industrial complex, the neoliberals. And that's why it's so important, I think, that we stand together in solidarity to take them on. And it's really important, I think, that political education and raising a political consciousness is so important. And just looking again as an outsider, and you're in the States, it kind of, I remember, I'm old enough to remember If anybody else on the program is, probably Tony will remember 1968 in the States. It feels like, you know, some of the activism that was around in the States at that time. It feels that is it's almost a replication of that. Although we have to remember, at the end of 1968, Nixon was elected as president, and clearly we have an election in the States at the end of this year, and you know, obviously Trump disaster, but then obviously Biden, you know, is responsible for many of the issues, as I understand it, that or policy changes that Trump is actually taking advantage of. But your point about you know, fabrication is ironic, because we know that the hack media in this country are past masters at fabrication. I'm sure that's the case in the States as well. And so more power to your elbow. The grey zone, if anybody who's watching is not familiar with the grey zone, look it up. It's an excellent output, and you won't be disappointed by the stuff that you'll get there. I just want to kind of come on now to some of the questions that we're getting from viewers, and preface one of them from Hal Cunty in relation to Zionism, because the UN back in 1975 passed a resolution 3379, which recognized Zionism as being a racist ideology. And yet, you know, 45 years later, people are thrown out of the Labour Party for using the term, and for suggesting that you know, Israel might be an apartheid state and so on. These are used as a pretext to expel people from the party. Very definite effort to try and chill free speech. And you know, Nick Robinson, who was the chief political correspondent for the BBC, in my last interview before I was suspended on the whole issue of anti-Semitism, and because I was saying, look, you know, the Labour Party is not institutionally anti-Semitic, and I have not encountered anti-Semitism in my 44 years membership of the party. And he seems obsessed with me and Jackie Walker, because on a number of occasions he has cited the fact that on social media about my support for Jackie Walker, and he was saying, oh, have you forgotten about Jackie Walker? And then he misrepresented what Jackie said about the slave trade as a way of trying to, you know, justify his accusation against me and about the Labour Party and against people like Jackie and others. But Hal Conte is asking this question, and it's really directed at you, Max. How can the American left learn from the experiences faced by Corbyn and his supporters and ensure Palestine stays in the headlines amidst this global pandemic?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, it's saying, but how can the American left learn from the experiences faced by Corbyn and his supporters and ensure Palestine stays in the headlines amidst this global pandemic?
I mean, that's a really good question, because the Palestine has really fallen from the headlines, and it's fallen from the consciousness of the left over the past several years, and as it's been elevated in the UK. I think right now in this moment, with people in the street who see the police and encounter the police as the front line of this vast empire, but don't understand it that way, who are novice activists. I've met many people at these protests who've never been to a protest before. It's important to talk to them about Israel's role in training our police and how Israel exports its lessons in repressing an indigenous population around the world. In the last round of Black Lives Matter protests, there was a sign in St. Louis someone held up that said, Google, Israel trains US police. And I'm not saying that Israel is responsible for our police being brutal. That's absurd. But there is a real relationship there. The former police chief of Washington, D.C., Kathy Lanier, called Israel the Harvard of counterterrorism. You know, if you see DC police cars driving around at all times, they have their sirens on silently in order to project their force and their presence. They learned that when Lanier's predecessor, Charles Ramsey, the police chief, went on the first trip to Israel that a police chief took. So this is one way of educating people. We have to look for these different moments to keep Palestine in people's consciousness, but there's been a deliberate effort to fracture the Palestine solidarity movement in the US, and it took place over the issue of Syria. Basically, anyone who stood against regime change in Syria, as I did, was sort of Palestine activists were pressured to blacklist them or disinvite them from universities, and members of the Syrian diaspora who, really represented either, the Islamist element or the oligarchic element that opposes the Syrian government, would really apply that pressure and say that you hate the Syrian people if you take this position. So there was this, it wasn't just a debate, it was just like this gigantic food fight within the Palestine Solidarity Movement that ripped it to shreds. Along with that, there was a blacklisting site called Canary Mission, which is exposed in the Lobby USA. Some of the billionaires behind it are exposed. No one knows who is behind it or has known who is behind it. And basically college students who had been, leaders of Students for Justice in Palestine or activists would have profiles made of them, and everything impolitic that they ever said would be put on this site. And the site was created with this explicit intention of getting them denied employment after college. And, most people who go to college really want jobs. And, if they're people of color or immigrants, they're going to be, targeted on that site as terrorists. There was one case where the FBI interrogated a Seton Hall law student who came up on Canary Mission. So there was, in addition to this internal fight, there was a external attack that I think, unfortunately, was kind of effective in intimidating a lot of people. And so I think, in some ways, the Palestine Solidarity Movement in the US is at a low ebb. Palestine goes out of the headlines when, Gaza is not under attack, but it's important to use every moment possible to elevate it. And this is one moment we have in the US and in the UK. You're having an upsurge in street mobilization during a pandemic. So it's a moment that can be used to teach people about Palestine.
Very encouraging, I think, that the Black Lives Matter, both on both sides of the Atlantic, actually, to see that consciousness raising. I mean, I attended a rally in my home city of Derby. It's the biggest rally I've ever seen in Derby. I mean, there were thousands of people there, and it was organised by people who had no involvement with the Labour movement. There were no trade union banners in sight. There were no Labour Party activists in any great number that I could witness. So that, I think, it's a challenge. It's also a positive step, but it's also a challenge to ensure that momentum is maintained, and that sort of politicization takes place, that political consciousness raising takes place. If I could maybe move on, because we're running short of time and there's a few questions piling up. There's one, I'll just put this one to, if I may, to Jackie. There's a couple actually. One from Monica saying, how can someone call a Jewish person an anti-Semite? And also one from Adam Waterhouse saying, how can we effectively push back against the anti-Semitism smear and intimidation campaign? And I wonder whether you might also want to comment, and I'll bring Tony in as well on this, on the UN resolution that was passed all those years ago, and what relevance that has today, when it's effectively, sort of a, I suppose, policy, if I could call it that, of the UN to acknowledge that Zionism is racism. What's your thoughts, Jackie?
Well, I think it's totally possible to have somebody who is Jewish and an anti-Semite. There's not many of them for obvious reasons. But in fact, what we're talking about when Jews are being called anti-Semites, particularly in such numbers as is happening in the Labour Party, is that we're not talking about anti-Semitism. We're talking about Jews who are anti-Zionists. And what they've done is a very kind of clever rewriting of what racism is. And this was planned by it started off as an academic exercise to theoretically transmute racism into opposition to Zionism. And it's now taken on this form. So if you say, I'm not a Zionist, you then get called racist. And we kind of can see how this has been transfigured, for example, in the way that, a few years ago, suddenly we had John Landsman saying we mustn't use the word Zionism. We mustn't use, I mean, Zionists can use the word Zionism. We have the Zionist World Federation. We have all sorts of Zionist parties. But anyone against Zionism mustn't speak about, mustn't name it Zionism. And what can we do about it? Well, I always say to people, being Black and Jewish gives you a very handy perspective. What is it? 400 years, Black people are still struggling for actual emancipation. I see what's happening to Black people now as a continuum from the exploitation of the peoples of Africa. It's no different. And if you think struggle for oppressed people happens, that a victory will happen very quickly or very easily, you're wrong. That's not what struggle is. It's often incremental. It often takes a long time. And then, all of a sudden you'll get lots of things happening. The watchword has to be resistance. Resistance.
Any thoughts, Tony, on that point? And would you like to pick up the UN aspect as well? You're on mute, Tony.
Yes, on the first thing, I always used to say it was adopted in 1977 and then repealed with the disastrous Oslo Accords, that yes, Zionism is a form of racism, but not because the United Nations says it is, because it rarely actually explained what it is. And if I can use a share screen again, I'll show you some just very simple examples of why Zionism is racism. Here's Richard Spencer, the neo-Nazi founder of the alt-right. He tells Israel they should respect him because I'm a white Zionist. Can everyone see that?
Not
or maybe not.
No.
No, okay, I'll do it again.
Let's come up now.
Yeah, there you are. He was a person who organised the fascist and neo-Nazis at Charlottesville, but he's a white Zionist because he really does admire what Israel is doing. He just wishes he could form a state in America, which was similar to that. If I can get off... there's another one. Can you see it or not?
No, it's staying
on. Okay, I think I've got to first get off that one. I'm not sure how I get this one off, but anyway, can you see me now anyway?
Yeah, we can see you, mate. Yeah, you just speak because we're out of time, Tony.
Zionism is racist because it decided to colonize and settle in a land that belonged to someone else and to displace those people. It's a movement of Jewish racial supremacy. But Zionism, and the irony of the anti-Semitism witch hunt, is no one had more in common with the anti-Semites than the Zionists. The anti-Semites rejected the idea that Jews belonged in non-Jewish countries. The Zionists also rejected that. And in fact, if you come across some of the quotes from the Zionists about the Jewish diaspora, which they hated, it was called negation of diaspora, you might well think it was an ordinary anti-Semite. For example, Pinchas Rosen, who was the first Israeli Minister of Justice, a liberal Zionist, said of Palestine that it was an institute for the fumigation of Jewish vermin. And there are numerous quotes like that. So Zionism has most in common with anti-Semitism because it has a racial conception of society. And Zionism from the start, as soon as it started colonization, was racist. In the diaspora, originally, it was a movement of despair. It was a movement of accommodation. It was a movement of adaptation to anti-Semitism. The anti-Semites said, you don't belong, and the Zionists said, yes, we agree. We need to form our own racial state, which, of course, is what happened. Yeah. Okay, so, I mean, that's something that people have been too coy about, rebutting the allegations. That's why Zionism in Britain never ever fought anti-Semitism. It never fought Mosley. It only fights anti-Zionism. And that's as true today as it was then. That's why all the world's anti-Semitic leaders find Israel a wonderful place. Viktor Orban, Bolsonaro, Duterte. The worse they are, the more avid they are in their love of Israel. So opposing Israel has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Can Jews be anti-Semites? Yes, it's strange, but that's what Zionism represents. When Zionism came about, Jews called it a form of Jewish anti-Semitism.
Interesting. Thanks, Tony. There's one here from Mark, I think, from Monica Shannon, saying, do you think that political correctness has an objective to divide people instead of unite them? And how can we fight this campaign against free speech? You're on mute, Mark. You're still on mute, Mark. Yeah, you can hear you now.
You can hear me?
Yeah,
I welcome that question, because I wanted to talk a bit about how Black Lives Matter, that protest movement over the lynching by a police officer in Minneapolis of an unarmed black man, George Floyd, how that protest has been covered. And there's been a co-option. Now, you know, institutional racism, systemic racism, I'm wary of those terms, by the way, because I think it often absolves individuals of blame and tries to blame inanimate objects like buildings and institutions. But the point I'm making is, what voices are being heard? Yes, we hear vox pops on the streets of protesters, but in the studios, and class comes into this, it's black middle class people talking to white middle class commentators and journalists and presenters. And the real voice of the streets and the radicals, the H-Rap Browns, for those of you who go back far enough to the Black Panthers and the Black Power movement, where are those voices? They're being kept out. And so often racism is not just by commission, the act of racism, but omission. Voices being kept out of the debate. And that's what's going on at the moment. And we're talking about censorship. That's a form of censorship. It's also a form of manufactured consent. The images of Patrick Hutchinson, you know, the black man lifting up a white thug in a fireman's lift,
yes,
carrying him to safety. Oh, that's wonderful. We'll have plenty of that. You know, the toppling of the statue of the racist slave owner, Edward Colston in Bristol. For me, that's iconic. He was toppled by white protesters, by the way, and I think that's the right role of white people, to step forward and be in a position where they do things like that. But this struggle has got to be led by black people, the anti-racist struggle, particularly the youth, the militant youth on the streets. And that's what we're seeing. And the victims of police brutality are black working class people. And that's not by any coincidence. And I want to see more voices, more radical voices in the so-called mainstream. And if we can't achieve it there, then we must use citizen journalism like Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old who so bravely filmed the public lynching of George Floyd. There's been talk of her being elevated to the level of Rosa Parks, who was born, made her act of not refusing to go to the back of the bus the year I was born. I think that Darnella is a hero, and you know, I'd like to hear from her. You know, let's hear her voice. Let's hear others like her being reported.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Mark. There's a question for Max now. We're already very short. We've gone over time actually, but I think just to try and get more people the opportunity to put their point. It's from Sean O'Donoghue, and I wonder as well, when you respond to this, Max, if you could also comment in terms of what's happening in the States, because I'm recently looking at some of the statements and comments from the former Black Panther leader who was assassinated by the Chicago police and FBI back in 1969. And he was very passionate about the importance of what he termed revolutionary education. I think this sense of raising political consciousness, how important that is. And I just wondered if you could maybe comment on that. Is that happening in the States now? Or, you know, is that something that needs to be built, as it were? Is there you know, an appetite, if you like, for that? And while you're thinking about that, just this question from Sean O'Donoghue saying the most powerful political organization in the world and the most invisible is the Council on Foreign Relations, with people like Liam Johnson, Liam Fox, British politicians, as their UK proxies. And he's posing the question, what chance has democracy given the influence of these kind of shady organizations. So a couple of points there, Max, if you could just touch on this.
Well, just quickly, because I did talk about the political moment in the US and what is taking place in the streets. There's definitely a clear effort to co-opt these protests, and many people involved in them are political novices. When you saw the protest here grow after this military show of force, much of the messaging was diluted, and it went from messaging about police terror, defunding the police, to vote them out. Trump is a racist, just focusing on Donald Trump. And the mayor, who controls the police funding, was given a free pass. You saw Democratic operatives inside the protest ranks handing out signs, anti-Trump signs, and free food, and then trying to register people to vote. And, it's great. I'm all for voting. But in some ways, they're trying to suppress the more radical demands. The demand to defund the police has survived, and we've seen police killings on camera since the protests over George Floyd's murder have begun. But the question is about the extent to which this movement will be co-opted and kind of turned into an anti-Trump color revolution, or whether it will survive and really start intensifying its, not just its messaging, but its organizing against the constant increase in funding of the police, the role that police unions, which are really cartels, play in cities, and to start seeing the police as simply the front line of a giant imperial system. This is really democracy in action, but we also see the kind of mainstream corporate political forces trying to suppress it. I think, just for what I do, I'm not really an organizer. I do cross the line into activism whenever I think it's necessary. I'm an advocacy journalist, but just what I see in the media is that people are turning to us more and more, that our voices are resonating, and our traffic at the gray zone is just constantly growing and growing because people feel betrayed. The media is the most hated institution in the US. And you can say it's because Trump incites against it, but it's, ultimately because they are pushing fake news and they're not acting in the public interest. And before this protest movement, where were the police to tell the story of working class Black people and people across this country who suffer from police terror and who are being evicted? Where was the media at the beginning of this pandemic to talk about the fact that people can't pay their rent? They weren't anywhere. And it's the same in your country, where the BBC, before every Tory massive social program cut, they spend zero resources showing what people are going through, showing inequality, and all their time with, phony punditry. So the media, we are creating, I created the gray zone because, as small as it is, as insignificant as it might be compared to an institution like the Council on Foreign Relations, it's an institution. And we have to just simply uphold our own institutions. Chris, I see you doing that with these events and, trying to do something outside the Labor Party. But that's really our only hope right now. Just to quickly on the CFR, I don't think it's as powerful as it was in the 60s and 70s when it formed a real shadow government. Each government in the US and each party has its own kind of apparatus of think tanks. The Trump administration has, the Heritage Foundation and the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. The Democrats have, Center for American Progress and, a few other foreign policy think tanks that they draw a lot of their personnel from. And it's really important to look at who funds these organizations, because you'll see the arms industry, Gulf monarchies that are not just anti-democratic, they're not democratic at all. There's no democracy. They are funded by the US government in many cases. They function as US government cutouts. And therefore, where's the hope for people who actually are involved in these grassroots struggles that are blossoming in the streets to go into government? There's very little hope. Government is for elites and by elites, and the think tank apparatus that we have here, which is being built up in the UK. You don't have the same problem with it right now, but it's being built up, and there's a lot of cross-pollination. The Atlantic Council, the German Marshall Fund, they're doing a lot of work inside the EU and UK to de-democratize societies. They really are a hallmark of an undemocratic society whose political class is completely detached from working people.
And in your point about the media not reflecting and reporting on the struggles of working class communities, and those struggles, I think, in some ways are similar on both sides of the Atlantic with the deindustrialization agenda that Thatcher and Reagan started. Not only do they not report on that, but they indulge in something that's been described as poverty porn over here. I don't know whether you have that in the States, where they have these appalling programs about so-called benefit scroungers and so on. It's kind of just reinforcing that demonization, if you like, of working class lives. It's an absolute disgrace, and something that we should rail against, in my opinion. Look, this is going to have to be the final question. We've gone on quite a bit longer than what we normally do, but we've had some excellent speakers, and there are so many questions, and we're not going to be able to get through them all. And we'll have to make this probably the last question, and it's one for the British-based panel, I think, although Max, you may have a view on it. It's from Alison Hall, and she's saying, do the panel think the information contained in the leaked report from the Labour Party will ever see the light of day? Although, it has seen the light of day because it's been leaked, but formally will ever see the light of day. And what she describes as the traitors and saboteurs who lost us 2 elections, will they be kicked out of the party? What's your thoughts on that, Tony? Do you think that's likely?
I don't think it's likely. I think we already know that Keir Starmer's first reaction to the report was to find out who leaked it. The information in it didn't particularly concern him, because I suspect he already knew what was happening. There's no doubt, we've only seen part of the information, there's no doubt that Tom Watson was a key link person with those people, and no doubt that information would have seeped down. But what was particularly marked was 2 things. Firstly, if you were a genuine anti-Semite in the Labour Party, the chances are nothing would be done about it by the compliance unit. They were only going after the left, after all. Yep. The second thing is that the actual abuse they engaged in should have led to their own suspensions anyway. I mean, John Stolliday, who is an interesting guy because he was head of the compliance unit and then moved over to being head of the members' relations unit in Unison. He was responsible for suspending me from both organisations, clearly a man of many talents. He described Ed Miliband as Beaker after his nose. Yeah. Now, if that's not anti-Semitic, I ask you what is. Yet this is the man in charge of purging Labour of anti-Semites. The racist treatment of Diane Abbott and others shows that this was a racist witch hunt. As Jackie said, disproportionate number of Jews, many black activists like Mark were the target. Why? For a Jewish community which has suffered nothing. If you ask who are the Jewish victims of the Labour anti-Semitism, you'd be hard-pressed to find one single name. Nobody suffered from this anti-Semitism crisis, which apparently has traumatised the Jewish community. What's traumatised them has been the Jewish Chronicle week after week telling them that we're on the brink of the Third Reich. It's got no material basis. So the leaked report, Starmer has set up a whitewash committee, and it will no doubt come up with its own recommendations. And we know that as far as Starmer is concerned, he is determined to purge the Labour Party of any anti-capitalist elements. Our job, I think, is to make that as difficult as possible for him. So we have to give the campaign group the Dutch courage that they don't have. We have to make it so difficult for them that in the end they actually have to come out. And my own view is that we have to be unified in terms of people inside and outside the Labour Party. At the moment,
didn't you, Tony? You invited the campaign group to speak at tonight's event, didn't you?
But that's true. I sent an invitation to every single member of the campaign group, 35 MPs. And I have to tell you, Chris, I was worried that we might not have time for all of them tonight. However, they did us a favour in one respect. None of them accepted. And that says everything about the Socialist campaign group. They really haven't got a spine between them.
And Mark, thank you, Tony. Mark, perhaps as a final contribution, what's your thoughts then about this report? Do you think it's your view that it's ever likely to see formally the light of day and the action taken against the people who effectively not effectively, absolutely sabotaged Labour's election chances certainly in 2017 and didn't do much to help in 2019 either?
The emails, the WhatsApp messages that were misogynist, ableist, they were racist against Dawn Butler, against the other black woman MP, Diane Abbott, against Clive Lewis, who they called the biggest cunt, talking about Diane Abbott weeping, hiding in a cupboard and grassing her up to a Fleet Street anti-Labour journalist, saying where she was sheltering in a restaurant and she could be found there. I mean, this should have been an immediate case of suspensions. You know, Jackie, yourself, Ken, Tony, myself, we were suspended for much less. And yet they're still working. They've still got big jobs. They're still Labour Party members. Yeah. And of course, Starmer, the right-wing, new right-wing leader, he's just seeking out the whistleblowers, which is shocking for a former director of public prosecutions and top lawyer. You know, whistleblowers.
Optimistic then about any action being taken against the perpetrators of.
None at all. So I'm saddened that they've put a black QC as head of the so-called independent inquiry. That's obviously a sort of cover for what they plan not to do. And we've just got to broadcast the message of the injustices that we've suffered and widen this out, as others have said on this program, to the issue of free speech, to the issue of manufactured consent. I mean, the manufactured consent that Ruth Smith was the victim, that she fled that inquiry in floods of tears. All of this is a lie. She's a big liar. She has been propagating lies about the amount of abuse she allegedly received as a result of what happened in that inquiry, which has been academically analysed. And, you know, she's received a fraction of the abuse. Diane Abbott, in fact, has suffered as a black woman MP 50% of all of the abuse of any MP, Labour, Conservative or Lib Dem. Yet that's not a national newspaper story, not a broadcast media story. I have to say, Jackie Walker was vindicated when she took on the former political editor of the BBC, Nick Robinson, who had to issue her with an apology. And I think that has to be said. I've been fighting my own battle of rebuttal against newspapers and been winning, and broadcasters, including the Jewish Chronicle, who had to change 14 stories on their website as a result of me taking them to the press watchdog Ipso, because they were insinuating that I was an anti-Semite. So all of that had to be changed. Sometimes you think you're banging your head against a brick wall, but I think the public need to go on the offensive in terms of correcting fake news that Max Blumenthal has described. And you can get successes. The sad thing about it is if it's newspapers, the newspaper's already been printed. You can't retrieve those newspapers. They were in circulation. You are traduced, you are libeled, and all that you can change is the record online. But we must continue with that fight and fight for against censorship and against the omission of radical voices like ours in the mainstream media.
No, thank you very much indeed, Mark, for those concluding remarks. And I'm very pleased that Max mentioned Julian Assange. His plight is a stain on Britain. It's an outrage that he languishes still in Belmarsh prison. I'm very disappointed that more people on the Labour benches haven't spoken out about Julian's plight. When I was a member of Parliament, I did speak out and did attend the vigils and rallies outside Belmarsh prison. And the only two other parliamentarians, as far as I'm aware, who spoke out in any way were Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott after Julian was unceremonially dragged from the Ecuadorian embassy, and he is a totem, it seems to me, of free speech, about the importance of free speech. He is a totemic in terms of the importance of a free press. And what is very disappointing, I think Max touched on this to some extent in his contributions, very disappointing, and I've made this point when I've spoken at the rallies outside Belmarsh, is the lack of support from journalists, from mainstream journalists, particularly when you consider that Julian is one of their own. So when we're talking about free speech, when we're talking about challenging the manufacturing of consent, it's really important, I think, that we keep Julian's plight at the forefront of our thoughts and at the forefront of our campaign. Listen, I want to thank everybody for watching. As I say, we've gone on for far longer than we normally do. This has been nearly 2 hours, and hopefully people have stayed with us. I hope you found it illuminating and interesting. I certainly have. We've had 4 brilliant speakers, I think, this evening. So if you could perhaps give a sort of a metaphorical round of applause, or a cyber round of space round of applause for Max Blumenthal, Jackie Walker, Marc Wadsworth, and Tony Greenstein, I think have been excellent speakers this evening. Apologies once again that we haven't been able to get round to everybody's question and contribution. We did our best, but unfortunately we run out of time. Time is the avenger. I'm afraid that it's run out. We're literally on 2 hours right now. So thanks for watching, and let's work together to take this campaign for free speech forward.